Hello, my friends. Let me keep this flowing in one continuous line of analysis, because the only way this makes sense is if you stop treating these headlines as separate stories and start seeing them as a single bargaining ecosystem, one in which every public statement is aimed at a secondary audience, every principle is a placeholder for leverage, and every supposed step toward peace is also a step in someone's domestic political survival strategy. Start with the most revealing pattern of all, the rotating designation of who is the obstacle to peace. One week it's Putin, the next week it's Zelensky, then back to Putin, then back to Zelensky, depending on what pressure needs to be applied, and more importantly, on which crowd needs to be managed. People call it inconsistency, as if Trump is confused. I don't buy that. The oscillation itself is the instrument. When he puts the spotlight on Zelensky when he says Ukraine is less ready, when he implies the talks are failing because of Zelensky, he isn't only talking to Kyiv, he is talking to Europe. He's telling Europe, in plain language, your entire project depends on me, and I can step away. That statement is a trigger. It forces European leaders into an emergency posture. Reassurance, pledges, new proposals, new packages, new attempts to keep Washington emotionally and politically committed. Then when Trump pivots back and casts Putin as the obstacle, that too is functional. It calms the Atlantic bureaucracy, blunts the narrative that he is tilting toward Moscow, and provides cover against internal sabotage. So the carousel becomes a pressure valve, one that vents stress in one direction while building leverage in another. And that's why it feels like nothing moves, because the movement isn't toward peace. The movement is toward improved bargaining positions and improved political cover. If this were an equal pressure tactic aimed at forcing a settlement, you would see convergence. You would see narrowing demands, measurable compromises, a tightening of the gap. Instead, you see churn and repetition because the incentives are structurally misaligned. Russia can wait while pressure accumulates because time and battlefield realities are their leverage. Ukraine cannot accept a settlement that looks like formal loss without risking internal legitimacy, because a leadership that signs away territory and admits defeat becomes politically endangered. Europe cannot fill the U.S. gap militarily, so Europe's strategy becomes psychological and political. Keep Washington tethered. And Trump's own incentives do not necessarily reward fast resolution, because unresolved conflict is a renewable source of leverage over Europe on money, defense spending, trade posture, sanctions alignment, and on issues that Europe would prefer not to discuss at all, like Greenland. So what looks like failure can be useful to multiple parties, which is why stalemate is not always accidental. Sometimes stalemate is the product. Now drop that into the Davos setting, because Davos is not a conference in the way ordinary people imagine it. It is a market. It's a bargaining bazaar. It compresses leaders, donors, power brokers, and institutional gatekeepers into one location. And it enables high-frequency persuasion, the kind that doesn't happen in formal channels. That's why you should expect a charm offensive there, and not just on one front. On the Ukraine front, the pitch will be security guarantees, backstops, frameworks, and commitments designed to keep the United States locked in. But running alongside that will be a more delicate conversation. And it won't be about Ukraine. It will be about Greenland, because Greenland is the one subject that forces Europe to confront how dependent it really is, and how little it can do when Washington decides to price that dependency. This is where Europe's self-deception becomes dangerous. European officials keep treating Trump's Greenland posture as rhetoric, as if it's a performance. That is already a mistake. You can argue about whether he will execute, but you cannot argue about the strategic message. The message is that NATO is not charity and that US power is transactional. Even if Trump never takes Greenland, he has already achieved something profound. He has moved the boundaries of what is openly discussable, and he has forced Europe into a client's posture, trying to persuade Washington that Europe can handle Arctic security, trying to demonstrate capability, trying to soothe the supposed concern about Russian and Chinese ships. That's why Denmark's response, more exercises, more footprint, doesn't function as deterrence. It's compliance theater. You don't deter the United States with a symbolic deployment. You perform seriousness in hopes the patron is satisfied. And the tragedy is that they are responding to the official justification while ignoring the real function of the issue, which is leverage. For Trump, the official story does not need to be accurate. It only needs to be useful. So Denmark can add dog sleds, patrols, personnel, and it still won't answer the deeper point, which is that Trump is saying, I decide what enough looks like, and I can redefine the rules when it suits U.S. interests. And that ties directly into the German vice chancellor's warning about transatlantic disintegration. When a senior European official says the relationship is disintegrating, that's not merely an observation. It's an admission that Europe has no serious plan for a world in which the US treats Europe as an optional theater rather than a permanent priority. Europe has lived for decades on a set of assumptions that U.S. attention is stable, that U.S. interests naturally align with Europe's, and that rules restrain raw bargaining. But now the U.S. is telegraphing something different. Western Hemisphere dominance, Arctic priorities, and a willingness to treat alliances as transactions. Europe is waking up to the idea that it can be handled like a client, not a partner. Clients don't set terms, they request them. And that reality produces panic, because Europe has built a security architecture that assumes the basket America will always hold. Now Europe sees the basket can crack, and it doesn't have an alternative basket. This is why the EU keeps reaching for financial instruments and legal postures, frozen assets, loans, deferred repayment narratives, because these are the levers it can pull without possessing hard power. But those levers are not cost-free, and the EU is constructing a political time bomb. When Ursula von der Leyen insists frozen Russian assets remain immobilized until the war ends and reparations are paid, and when she repeats the line that Ukraine won't have to repay a major loan until reparations are paid, she is projecting leverage. Yet Russia has repeatedly signaled it will not pay reparations. That means the EU is building an arrangement whose moral framing depends on a condition the counterparty rejects. Meanwhile, EU taxpayers absorb the borrowing costs. The loan is interest-free for Ukraine, but not interest-free in reality. The interest exists, it just lands on someone else. And Politico's point 3 to 4 billion euros per year in borrowing costs from 2028 matters, because it creates a delayed fuse. You don't feel it right away, then it hits when war fatigue is deeper, when domestic budgets are tighter, and when political patience has thinned. That's how support collapses, not in one grand vote, but in slow disillusionment followed by sudden revolt. There is also a longer-term risk that European elites keep dismissing. The more Europe speaks casually about seizing or transferring assets, the more it trains the rest of the world to treat European jurisdictions as politicized financial space, and that has consequences beyond this war. Trust, once broken, doesn't return on command. Now put all of that into the reality that these talks are not single issue. The Ukraine war has become the front-facing chapter of a broader negotiation bundle. That's why you keep seeing Venezuela, Iran, Greenland, sanctions, and trade floating through the same conversation. Each issue becomes a chip. A concession here buys flexibility there. A gesture there buys delay here. A rumor of talks buys market calm and political breathing room. That's why the reported notion of intermediaries meeting Putin matters even if it never happens. The signal is the point. It tells Moscow there are channels. It tells Europe it is not the only audience. It tells Kyiv that nothing is permanent. It tells Washington's bureaucracy that the president can run foreign policy over their heads. And when Trump says he's not aware of a trip by people who would report directly to him, the denial itself is also a signal discipline. The narrative, centralize control, keep intermediaries from freelancing, and keep both allies and adversaries uncertain about what is real and what is theater. Uncertainty is not always a flaw in negotiation. Sometimes it is a deliberate instrument. So when you ask why nothing feels closer to peace than it did months ago, the answer is that several players do not benefit from a rapid, clean resolution on terms that would satisfy everyone. The bargaining zone is narrow because political survival zones barely overlap. Trump wants maximum leverage with minimum long-term commitment and a settlement that can be sold as "I ended it" without owning the costs. Europe wants the U.S. engaged, wants to avoid admitting Europe cannot defend itself, wants to prevent a NATO humiliation, and wants to postpone the day the bill comes due. Ukraine needs continuing support and cannot sign what looks like defeat without destabilizing its own legitimacy. Russia wants recognition of battlefield realities and wants to fracture the Western coalition while ending sanctions pressure on better terms. In that configuration, stalemate becomes the default. Public statements become choreography. Frameworks become talking points. Summits become demonstrations aimed less at the opponent and more at persuading domestic and allied audiences. Greenland becomes a test case of U.S. transactional power. Frozen assets become Europe's substitute for military capacity. Davos becomes the marketplace where the bargaining becomes visible. And the core conclusion that ties everything together is this: what you are watching is not simply a peace process. It is a contest over who sets the terms of the post-Ukraine order and who pays the costs of that order. Trump's toggling of blame is a lever to control tempo and extract concessions. Europe's panic around Greenland is the symptom of structural dependency. The EU's frozen assets posture is leverage talk that hides weakness while creating delayed fiscal and legal blowback. Russia's patience reflects confidence that time and battlefield realities will shape the table. Ukraine's reluctance reflects the political impossibility of admitting loss. That is why the same cycle repeats. That is why the headlines feel like motion while the strategic reality stays stuck. And unless something dramatically changes on the battlefield, in U.S. domestic politics, or in Europe's ability to shoulder hard power, expect more choreography, more pressure tactics, more charm offensives, and more principled financial maneuvers that quietly shift the costs onto taxpayers while leaders promise it's all free. If you want, I can keep writing from exactly this point. Continuing seamlessly into three plausible near-term pathways. Trump reduces engagement. Trump stays but trades, or Europe's financial, legal leverage backfires, and I'll keep the same continuous, single-voice flow. All right, let's deal with what actually happened versus what we were told was about to happen. Reuters reported, citing its usual sources, that military action against Iran was coming. And if you look at the indicators over the last 24 hours, it's hard to deny we came very close to a strike. You had movements of personnel out of exposed positions in the Gulf states, Qatar, and elsewhere, which is not proof an attack isn't coming. It's often a sign planners expect something and want vulnerable troops out of harm's way. You had interruptions to flights, airspace disruption, and extraordinarily heated rhetoric coming out of Iran. You had reports that Iranian aircraft had taken off, and people need to understand what that means. It wasn't some heroic plan to shoot down American planes. It was to keep Iranian aircraft from being destroyed on their runways in the first wave. Everything pointed to an operation being staged. And then suddenly we get the pivot. Trump weighs in publicly, tones down his rhetoric, and as we record this, there has been no U.S. strike. Flights are resuming, and there's also that report floating around amplified in major press that Israel and Iran, through Russia, arrived at some kind of understanding that neither side would strike first. Now, with Trump, you always have to assume misdirection is built into the performance. He can appear to be de-escalating while privately laying the groundwork for escalation. He can project calm precisely to lull everyone into relaxing. So I'm not telling you the strike has been canceled. The more realistic assessment is that it has been postponed. And the fact that it was postponed is the story, because it tells you the threshold Trump is demanding and the constraints he's running into. According to reporting that has circulated widely, Trump met with his national security team and said he would only authorize another attack on Iran if it could guarantee regime change. That is an extraordinarily high bar, and it's revealing because it strips away the remaining pretense about what this is really about. Notice how the nuclear enrichment program hardly features anymore. People have largely stopped talking about enrichment as the central justification. The conversation is now straightforwardly about regime change, and that means the operational logic changes. If you can't see a credible pathway from a strike to the collapse of the government, then you risk getting stuck in a confrontation you didn't want, especially if you're Trump and you dislike long, open-ended commitments, boots on the ground, and the Bush-Cheney-style occupation model. Trump's version of the neocon impulse is not nation-building for a decade. It's a quick knockout. He wants a shock and awe outcome that removes the government rapidly. He will use drones into residences, decapitation strikes, intelligence penetration, bribery, psychological warfare, whatever creates the appearance of inevitability so long as he can avoid the long war. That's why this moment matters. Iran, at least for now, didn't collapse in the way the planners needed it to collapse, and therefore the quick win wasn't guaranteed. Despite heated denials, it does look as if Iranian authorities got on top of the protest movement. I'm not claiming every protest has vanished, and I'm not denying Iran has real internal grievances. But the back of the protests appears to have been broken over the last couple of days, which changes the entire picture. If your regime change plan depends on synchronized unrest, mass mobilization, seizing buildings, a narrative of the state losing control, then you need that unrest to be alive and accelerating at the moment you strike. Once that piece is taken off the board, doubts grow inside Washington because a strike without an internal collapse dynamic becomes far more dangerous, far more expensive, and far less likely to produce the one outcome Trump says he wants. And that brings us to the second reason for postponement, which I think is more significant in the long run, the shadow of Russia falling over this theater. We've been discussing for some time that Moscow has been reviewing and recalibrating its foreign policy, and it now looks like we're starting to see the results: practical assistance and diplomatic intervention, not slogans. One of the things that was expected to facilitate the protests was the use of Starlink terminals that had been smuggled into Iran. The numbers being thrown around are likely exaggerated, but the basic point is not in doubt. The protest movement relied heavily on Starlink, and the expectation in many quarters was that Iran could not sustain a tight communications lockdown and certainly could not meaningfully defeat satellite connectivity. Yet Iran imposed a far tighter internet blockade than many anticipated, shut down mobile networks in ways people did not expect, and most importantly managed to jam Starlink sufficiently to disrupt coordination. This is the giveaway. Iran does not have the scientific and technological resources to do this at the required level on its own. Someone helped them. The only plausible candidates are China and Russia, and while it's possible the underlying technology was developed by China or co-developed, the immediate operational assistance looks overwhelmingly consistent with Russia. People say, wouldn't it have been China? Because Russia still has problems with Starlink in Ukraine? Yes, Russia has issues with Starlink on the battlefield because this is not a domain where one side wins forever. It's a constant cat and mouse game of jamming, frequency changes, updates, workarounds, and tactical adaptation. But what we understand is that Russia can jam Starlink from short distances right on the front lines, and Russia has been able to track and destroy Starlink terminals in Ukraine with increasing effectiveness. That doesn't mean Starlink becomes useless everywhere all at once. It means it can be degraded locally and tactically. In an internal security environment like Iran, you don't need 100% shutdown to change the outcome. Even 60-70% disruption can be decisive because it breaks coordination, slows mobilization, fragments messaging, and drains momentum. So the most plausible picture is that Iran got help, possibly Russian and Chinese help together, and that assistance played a direct role in blunting the protest wave at a critical moment, which in turn undermined the guaranteed regime change logic Trump was demanding. Add to that the diplomatic layer. There are credible reports that Russia has been talking to both Israelis and Iranians, telling both sides to back off, and the claimed understanding that neither would strike first fits the pattern of Moscow acting as a stabilizer. But there's another piece that may have provided Trump the political off-ramp he needed: the issue of serial executions. Iran was reportedly moving toward executions after the suppression of protests, and whoever advised Tehran to stop or postpone those executions did them a strategic favor. Those executions would have been disastrous for Iran's international image, potentially reignited protests inside Iran, further delegitimized the authorities with their own population, and crucially handed Trump an easy moral political justification to strike. If Moscow told Iran, for heaven's sake, stop this, you're putting a loaded gun in Trump's hands, and Iran listened, then once Trump received the message that executions were postponed or called off, he had the face-saving rationale to delay. That is how great power crisis management actually works. Quiet pressure, removal of triggers, and the creation of exits that allow leaders to step back without appearing to retreat. And while we're talking about Starlink, it's impossible to ignore the role of Elon Musk in these regime change mechanics. Trump even hinted recently that he planned to speak with Musk about Starlink. Musk may posture against regime change operations rhetorically, but Starlink has been integral in Ukraine and clearly plays a role wherever information warfare and coordination are central. Musk himself has effectively acknowledged his closeness to the intelligence community and his frequent contact with them. There's no mystery there. His companies are embedded in the U.S. national security ecosystem, and Starlink is one of the enabling tools for the kind of rapid destabilization strategies Washington prefers when it wants a knockout. That's why this isn't simply a technology story, it's a power story. And it's also why the Iranians, if they have any strategic sense, must stop behaving as if this is over because one strike didn't happen on one day. The key takeaway is that regime change in Iran is now openly the objective. Trump has signed up to it, Israel has signed up to it, and the broader U.S. policy machine has signed up to it. This didn't begin yesterday. There was an attempted regime change back in June, and that attempt began like a classic decapitation strike, something you do to collapse a government, not to pause enrichment. It happened, moreover, under extraordinarily duplicitous circumstances. Negotiations were supposed to be happening, omen was in the air, and then the attack landed anyway. What remains astonishing is that the warning signs were widely discussed in U.S. media, and still Iran was caught by surprise. That should never have happened. And it points to a broader problem. Iran still doesn't fully grasp what it is facing or hasn't built the institutional competence to respond. After the June 12-day war, it was obvious the failure to achieve regime change meant Iran would remain unfinished business, and they would come back. They did come back. This latest episode mixed internal unrest, information warfare, economic pressure, and external enabling Starlink terminals, coordination, propaganda momentum. Again, this is not to deny internal causes of protest in Iran. The grievances are real. But it is also obvious there was organization and external leverage intended to turn protests into a regime change crisis, and the Starlink factor is one of the clearest markers of that. Now, maybe this particular attempt has been called off or paused, but if Iran dithers, fails to prepare properly, and continues to stumble, another attempt is coming, and I would go further. As surely as night follows day, another serious regime change push is likely within the year because the strategic objective hasn't changed. Only the timing and method. The reason the strike was postponed is not that Washington has had a moral awakening, It's that the operation is proving more complicated than the Israelis and the neocons expected. Many of them likely assumed Iran would collapse like a house of cards the moment a decapitation strike landed, and that didn't happen. They tried other methods. They didn't work either, but they will iterate. Iran, meanwhile, keeps getting caught unprepared. They were not ready to handle protests at the outset. They responded with excessive violence early on, which is always counterproductive because it fuels delegitimization and propaganda, and when armed elements appeared, they looked unready for that escalation. For a moment, it began to look as if they might lose control. They were fortunate that someone, Russia, China, or both, appears to have provided crucial assistance, because without that, momentum might have carried the crisis to a place where regime change became plausible. And even if you set aside the street dynamics, Iran continues to underperform on the economic front. And that is unforgivable in strategic terms because economic instability is one of the easiest regime change levers for an opponent to pull. The very first thing that ignited this latest wave was a collapse of the Iranian currency on the order of 40% in the account we're discussing. Why wasn't there an immediate stabilization effort? Why didn't the leadership call China or relevant BRICS mechanisms and say, we need $1 billion to defend the currency and break the panic? We are not talking about vast sums. For China, $1 billion is small change.